Title: The Last Responder. It had been 3 days since the outbreak. The world as Sarah knew it had crumbled into chaos, and the infection spread faster than anyone could have imagined. Hospitals, once bustling with activity, now stood silent and eerily empty, save for the occasional distant scream or the soft shuffling of infected bodies. Sarah, a nurse by profession, was one of the few still trying to keep her humanity intact. She had seen the first signs of the infection on the news, vague reports of a new virus that made people aggressive and delirious. But like many, she thought it would pass, like so many other outbreaks before it. It didn't. By the time the reality of it hit, it was already too late. The hospitals were overwhelmed. First responders couldn't keep up with the surge of patients, but Sarah couldn't leave. She couldn't turn her back on the very thing that had always been her calling: saving lives. At the hospital, she worked alongside a few remaining doctors and staff, trying to stabilize the overwhelmed emergency room. They treated the infected as best they could, but the virus was unlike anything they had ever seen. Some recovered, only to relapse hours later with a far more violent strain. Others didn't recover at all. By the third day, Sarah realized that the only way to survive was to trust no one, even her fellow healthcare workers. Everyone was a potential carrier. The idea of being isolated, yet still tethered to the survival of others, made her heart heavy with uncertainty. That afternoon, while preparing makeshift bandages in the abandoned break room, the distant sound of a door slamming caught her attention. She grabbed a nearby medical bag and cautiously peeked around the corner. A man, covered in blood, stumbled through the hallway. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. His skin was pale, his eyes wild, and he had a deep gash on his arm. "Help me," he rasped, his voice weak but desperate. "Stay back," Sarah snapped, instinctively pulling out a syringe of sedative. Her training kicked in. She wasn't going to risk it. If he was infected, she couldn't afford to help him. But she couldn't leave him to die either. His eyes met hers, pleading. "I'm not one of them. Please, I need help. I've been running for days." Against her better judgment, Sarah hesitated. She couldn't leave him. It wasn't in her nature. She stepped forward, quickly administering the sedative into his arm. Within seconds, he collapsed to the floor. Her heart pounded as she checked his vitals. Stable. For now. While Sarah worked quickly to treat his wound, her thoughts swirled. Who was this man? Where had he been? Could she trust him? As the man stirred and began to regain consciousness, she stood back. She couldn't afford to be weak. Thank you," he muttered groggily, sitting up. "My name's David." "Sarah," she replied, her voice hard. "What happened to you?" David took a shaky breath. "I was at a shelter. They were supposed to be safe, but—" His voice trailed off as he stared at the floor. "It's over. Everyone's gone." The words hung heavy in the air. Sarah didn't know if safe existed anymore. Not in a world like this. "I don't know how much longer I can last on my own," David continued. "The streets are crawling with them. I was hoping maybe you knew a way out?" Sarah was silent for a moment, torn between the instinct to protect and the cold reality of the situation. It wasn't just a virus anymore. It was the collapse of everything. But there was one thing Sarah knew for certain. She couldn't do it alone. Neither could he. "We stick together," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling around them. "I know how to survive in a crisis, and you've got to trust me. We don't have time to doubt." They gathered supplies, gauze, antibiotics, a few painkillers, anything that could be useful. As they set off through the darkened hospital, Sarah led the way. They moved quickly, avoiding the areas that had been overrun by the infected. As they reached the hospital's exit, Sarah saw the city skyline in the distance. The world was no longer recognizable. Fires burned in the distance. Cars sat abandoned in the streets. The sound of distant growls and screams echoed through the night. But Sarah wasn't scared. Not anymore. Her hands were steady as she checked her medical supplies, adjusted her backpack, and looked at David. "We make our way to the outskirts of the city," Sarah said, her voice unwavering. "We find a place to regroup, to figure out what's next." And so, with nothing but each other, a shared will to survive, and Sarah's unwavering resolve, they stepped into the unknown. Because in this new world, there were no guarantees, only the will to survive, and the hope that there was still something worth saving. And for Sarah, that hope was found in every life she could save, no matter how small or fleeting.